Thank you very much. So there's been a lot going on in this area that I'm going to give you an overview of, followed by a brief overview of what's going on within the SVIN registry. This has really been spearheaded by Diogo, who is here, and these are his slides at the end as well. But speaking a little bit more about quality and outcomes in stroke treatment, specifically looking at endovascular therapy and what's going on in terms of routine practice as well as in terms of research. So the title was The Future of Data, and I would argue that, data is our future. Almost everything we do, and definitely in the healthcare space, is based around data. And the type of data that is most important is real-world data, real-world evidence. This goes far beyond trials. And this is important to consider because this is not where we had data from originally. Not so many years ago when people would ask about where's your data, where the evidence, the only thing that you could cite as evidence was a randomized controlled trial. Or earlier stage trial. I'll speak a little bit about big data considerations because I think that they're interesting issues in terms of the amount of data that are available that is now developing, and speak a little bit about what we think about in terms of quality and how the term quality is used because this does get thrown around a lot. But of course it's linked with outcomes. The quality should be based on better outcomes of our patients. And a lot of this leads to opportunities for research and how to improve what we're doing. Now, those two things are different. The quality outcome approach is different than a research study per se in terms of the mechanisms that we get to study these things. And I do want to provide a little bit of historical perspective on and the philosophy about what's going on in terms of trials versus registries. So there are a number of different registries that have been pursued. Societal registries such as the SVIN registry, NVQI that I'll mention again a little bit later. There have been several industry-sponsored registries. There's a regulatory initiative as well, and then daily registries. One can argue that what we do and get with the guidelines is a registry of routinely treated patients. But all of these differ in terms of the variables that are collected, the focus, how the data is used, who's doing it, and despite the fact that they all relate to treatment of the same patients. So this has caused a little bit of a complex scenario. The main regulatory initiative is Daisy. It is devices used in acute ischemic stroke intervention, a CRN, which is a coordinated registry network. Coordinated registry network is one, this is in stroke, an example of at least 15 that FDA has pursued through this mechanism called MD-EpiNet, where there's an overwhelming focus on real-world data, how we treat patients every day, everywhere, not focused on the trials. So FDA is very much focused on this in terms of understanding very generalizable and important data about routine treatment of patients. There is a little bit to mention about, so where does NIH come in from a research standpoint? What has been going on, and I'll mention that as well as get with the guidelines. There are combined attempts to merge prospective trial design with potential real-world data. And as you can imagine, that causes a little bit of a conflict because a trial is not a registry, and these are actually very different approaches. There are data issues, as mentioned. There's, the first starting with, codification of your common data elements. What variables are you specifying? There's ownership issues. Ultimately, I'll tell you right now that individual patients own their data, but if not sought that way, basically it's a sponsor that owns the data. And sometimes this is forgotten and this gets confused. Data use has to be regulated, and there's very important authorship and sustainability issues that come up with any registry. Are you doing this registry for 2 years, for a certain amount of time until enthusiasm drifts, or is it something that's really going to monitor things over a longer period of time? And finding the financial viability is a real question to support this and how this evolves. So, and I mentioned as well, I'll touch upon the SVIN registry at the end. So we've had trials of registries, attempts at different registries. And we've gone from trials where there's a singular hypothesis in multivariable randomized controlled trials typically, where that hypothesis is that treatment X works, comparing it to the other arm. And what tends to happen is that we then do subgroup analyses, post-hoc subgroup analyses that fuel the next trial because that evidence is not good enough because it's post-hoc. and it's not pre-specified necessarily. There's a lot of philosophical issues regarding the data. How do we analyze multiple things at once rather than going after one singular hypothesis? And it's problematic. There can be subtle interactions that take place between variables and adjunctive treatment. The combination of what a large core does with a late treatment patient or with a specific approach, therapeutic approach, these are all different variables that combine. These are not separate trials. You know, it's quite artificial to think about the fact that we're actually studying one thing at a time, because we're not. We treat one patient at a time, but with multiple variables behind that. So how do we constrain these pre-specified analyses plans? And these are important because if you go to anybody from a regulatory or scientific standpoint, they'll say you have to pre-specify. You can't come to us afterwards and tell us that you had thought about this because you hadn't planned this, you hadn't laid it out. And that's important because there may be all kinds of biases and issues with the data. So missing data is something that's very important in terms of real-world data, real-world evidence. The biases that selection biases and other types of biases, ascertainment biases that occur as well. But these are sort of the dirty issues that will always occur with routine data. So examples focusing here on endovascular therapy, academic ones, NASA track, societal ones, NVQI, which is now a conglomeration, an agreement between QOD and the CNS and SNIS behind NVQI. SVIN has been approached about joining this for the purpose of feeding data into this Daisy entity that I'll speak about in a moment. Industry, the example shown here, Stratus Registry, Retriever, Complete, and I left off as well as Excellent. So from the sponsors, different registries that have occurred, and as I mentioned, our daily registry of endovascular therapy. But I'll point out that our daily registry of endovascular therapy basically gives a thumbs up, thumbs down. So site reported, typically the proceduralist reported TICI score to tell you that that's the quality that goes along with that procedure, and that JCO can then say you have 100% TICI 3s, and therefore you have perfect quality and no questions asked and move forward. That's not very useful because it's not realistic and it's not trustworthy. So the data and get with the guidelines, with the very few variables that it actually captures about endovascular therapy, are limited. And then the other aspect to that is that some basic things, site of vessel occlusion, the types of things we study in larger scale registries or trials regarding endovascular therapy have no variables in get with the guidelines. They're not routinely captured. So basic things. Where's the site of occlusion? Is that an M1 or an M2? What happens with the patients that you don't treat with M1 or M2? We've had a big problem because we don't know about the basilar occlusions that aren't treated. There's no data. Get with the guidelines has absolutely zero data on that because that's not collected because they weren't treated. So data science is obviously evolving. It's tremendous. There have been tremendous gains and advances in the field of data science, not just in terms of the types of data we have, but in terms of the approaches. I mean, there's a plethora of imaging techniques, genomics, expressomics, resistance measures, and also understanding what the response to a particular therapy is. Not just saying that you put somebody on an antihypertensive medication, but did their blood pressure actually come down? And looking at what happens with that individual patient rather than treatment assignment. There's a lot that goes on in terms of AI you heard about earlier this morning, and the precision medicine of large-scale data analytics. So I've mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. We're about to see a data tsunami, and everybody is avoiding this. We're avoiding this because we don't know how to handle this. So when patients come, like this patient that visited me from Beijing with 20 years of blood pressure recordings handwritten, we don't know how to handle it at all. Now, the solution is if it were digital, you can actually review this and bill for it. But there's a lot to go through. And obviously, if it were graphed out or provided in some other way, it would be a lot easier. The technologies are evolving. Mobile health technologies, patient-reported cognition, physical activity measures, and others are going to be evolving. And patients are bringing their Fitbits and other devices to the hospital now, giving information about what was happening before their stroke as well. But we do need some data therapy, and this is therapy for us as investigators, us as routinely treating stroke providers, and in our other roles. Because what happens is that when you're about to do a study, whether it's a registry or any type of study, the first question is, okay, let's develop the CRF, the case report form. Let's figure out what variables we need. And then the question boils down to, is this variable really important? Should we bother to do that? And of course, this is balanced by the fact that we don't want to create extra work, especially when you're dealing with real-world data. You don't want to have to make things difficult. You want things to be seamless. And other aspects. Missing data, we can't get bent out of shape about this. There's always going to be missing data. This is just a simple fact. And we have to understand that we have to deal with what is quite dirty data, and we have to be ready for that. So I think we need a little bit of adjustment in terms of our approach to data. So Daisy is an endovascular therapy registry, a coordinated registry network that is not one registry. It's not one centralized registry. The concept of a CRN is that you pool together multiple data sources and through linkage can link to specific device use, as well as make sure that you're not double or triple counting cases and that you're ascertaining those cases individually. And this was launched in 2017, now in January, almost 3 years ago. We've learned a lot along the way in terms of working with FDA. Daisy is chaired by myself with Adnan Siddiqui and Samir Ansari, bringing a multidisciplinary approach to the table. The first study that we are launching now is a pilot study on posterior circulation thrombectomy. I should say this has been refined to specifically basilar artery occlusion, looking at what happens with patients nowadays. Part of the difficulty has been this issue of, well, do we have a proper mindset or perspective to look at this? FDA has asked, well, we need to see a lot of patients that aren't treated with basilar artery occlusions. We've tried to explain that's not going to happen nowadays in this country, at least, because there's very little data on that, and those that aren't treated are not treated for other reasons. So there's issues there in terms of how do you approach problems like this, with ultimately the question about, the practical implication is that a national coverage decision can be made, and even before that, an indication for basilar artery occlusion. So dealing with things that we commonly encounter, but are technically off-label. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly through these slides, but just I mentioned this in terms of the different CRNs. This list has grown now at FDA in terms of various different areas in terms of most medical or a lot of medical disorders. The Daisy objective is to look at device use. This is a post-marketing platform. This is something that has been discussed by FDA for more than a decade, but we waited for the trials to be positive. We waited for data from the trials to emanate to really allow this to take place. And as mentioned, the ultimate goal is not just expanded indications, but a national coverage determination. And as well, to be an asset of core data that can be used for future single-arm studies where you have a comparator group, a historical comparator group that can be used. So this brings together stakeholders from multiple entities as shown here. This has been quite dynamic, much like stroke. Things change. The questions from FDA change. The scientific or clinical questions very rapidly evolve within a 12 to 18-month period. And as a result, even these things that I mentioned in terms of which variables are we looking at and how is it being acquired must change and adapt. Let's skip over that. So Daisy is at a point now where it is finally blossoming into a practical application in terms of basilar artery occlusion. The emphasis here is on what we do on a daily basis. This has prompted a large-scale analysis from NVQI of hundreds of patients with basilar artery occlusions to look at the data, as well as separately approaches that will bring together within Daisy industry-sponsored registry data together with other societies such as SVIN to look at the same question. I'm going to skip over this. To make a couple other points. Imaging and angiography, these variables are unique to endovascular therapy, right? Most of the data that we are concerned with has to do with, what are you treating? Where are you treating? What device did you use? How many passes? What was the result angiographically? Because if you're looking at the impact of your endovascular therapy, you have to look at these variables. It also relies heavily on who did you treat. And the best way to characterize who you treated is with the imaging at baseline. So it's not just age and sex are not going to get you very far. You're going to need to know a lot more, and it's rooted in the imaging and angiography. And keep in mind that FDA has made it very, very clear that they are not going to do anything without detailed imaging and angiography adjudication. So basically, the thumbs up, ticky 3 that site reported will not fly. That will not be trusted. This was the original document that FDA put out looking at Daisy, and what's highlighted in yellow on that list is everything that's imaging or angiography. So probably at least 80% of what they were interested in has to do with that. They've made it very clear that imaging adjudication, validation has to take place as well, and preserved. So there's different mechanisms that have been proposed for this, some that are quite basic and some that are quite novel, using blockchain technologies, novel networks to pool data across the distributed network as well. There are a lot of different approaches that have been suggested in terms of, whether it's expert adjudication of the imaging and angiography or through machine learning and other AI features. So at the same time, on the NIH front, very recently, within StrokeNet, the message went out that you cannot do one study of endovascular therapy. They want to study everything all at once. So a platform was necessary. And a platform trial is something that's been around for a while, shown in this JAMA publication on the left, where you adapt your trial depending on what the response or the characteristics of the patients are in the study. This has been proposed within StrokeNet. Some of you may have heard about this at the recent StrokeNet annual investigators meeting a couple weeks ago here in Atlanta. But what was proposed was really not a registry of 10,000 patients. What was really proposed was a prospective randomized trial, right, that looked at several things all at once. And I find this problematic because you're back to square one again. You're back to doing a trial. And those 4 things that were proposed were modified Rankin with a cut point of 2, aspects of 6, the NIH Triskel score of 6, and looking at vessel occlusions beyond an ICA or M1. And what I mean by looking at those things, randomizing all patients that don't fall within those established categories. And that's an issue because now you're doing a trial of all these things at once and forcing us to randomize patients. So this would force randomization of a basilar artery occlusion, for instance. And very little in terms of data structure to bring in, coming back to the Get With the Guidelines, relying on whatever's in Get With the Guidelines to bring the data in. So there's a lot of data that can be used in the future, things that we need to register going forward, such as the one shown here. And a lot of things that are interesting to measure. I'm not so sure that the approach that was proposed recently is the way to go. We need this to be easy. We need to be able to take the data that we have on a daily basis, whether it's from procedural notes, whether it's from our other notes, and integrate that very easily, and do this cheaply, seamlessly with routine care of patients. The common data elements have been established by NINDS for endovascular therapy, and there's some basic ones. The problem is not in finalizing the common data elements. The problem is in using them and deciding to put data in those fields. So finally, before I just mention the SVIN registry, there are a lot of big data issues. So once you get beyond the codification to deciding which variables you're going to collect, ownership, as I mentioned, who owns the data, And what happens when you do another investigator-sponsored study and you move data from one data set and you pool it with another? Do you call it a different name and then someone else owns it? I don't think so. Data use has to be strictly enforced, including the authorship and a mechanism, an infrastructure to support this after the first couple of years. This is something that's come up within HRME, which is an investigator-initiated sponsored study funded by largely by Medtronic, and pooling of data is a big issue. So just finally talking for a couple of minutes about SVIN registry, I'm doing this on behalf of Diogo, who's really done the lion's share of the work in terms of getting this going. We've been talking about this for a long time. I'm going to skip over this in terms of the SVIN mission statement. Some of these slides are circulating during the breaks as well. Obviously, the goal is to improve the outcome of our patients. We know what the vision is as well. I'm going to skip to the data, just pointing out that the SVIN registry was finally launched in the last year, looking at large vessel occlusion and acute ischemic stroke, obviously fueled by several centers here within SVIN, with the objective highlighted in bold there. These are the active sites. There are many more that are coming online. Part of the process has been to get our IRBs aligned, to get our data aligned, and to get things so we're speaking the same data language in terms of in one combined data set. This is the enrollment shown here. Very remarkable numbers, as usual, from Grady, and with other sites ongoing and developing rapidly. This is extremely impressive. This is the data, the number of cases that can be acquired in a very short time. And I hate to say this, but the amount of time we spent discussing and planning this SVIN registry, even over the last couple of years, this number could be several-fold. And I can say that the good news is that it will be several-fold coming up. So I'm going to leave these up here and just go to the very last slide and just say that anybody that's interested in joining this group can contact us via this email address. Thank you.